Sterling Vance entered the Fairfax County courtroom with a chilling display of arrogance, laughing openly at the family of the man he had brutally murdered, Elias Thorne. Confident his status as a senator's son would serve as an impenetrable shield, he treated the life sentence proceedings as a tedious inconvenience, checking his watch and rolling his eyes while the victim's daughter sobbed just feet away. He believed he was untouchable, a prince hovering above the laws of ordinary men. But the most damning testimony would not come from a forensic expert or a police officer, but from the one person who knew the truth behind his monstrous facade, his own mother, Victoria. She sat stone-faced in the gallery, clutching the digital evidence that would shatter his world. Sterling thought she was his savior. He was unaware that she was about to become his executioner. I urge you to watch this story until the very final second. What you are about to witness will change your perspective on the limits of power and the price of justice. If you believe the truth deserves to be heard, please support this channel by subscribing now. And before we descend into the darkness of this case, let us know in the comments where you are watching from tonight. The tragedy that brought them to this breaking point began on a quiet, humid evening in late September. The morning of September 24th began with the smell of wet earth and the distant rhythmic hum of cicadas in Alexandria, Virginia. It was a day that promised the heavy, lingering heat of an Indian summer, the kind of weather that slows the pulse of the city and drives its inhabitants toward the shade. In the modest, working-class neighborhood of Del Rey, the sun was just beginning to burn through the morning mist, casting long, pale shadows across the rows of small bungalows and carefully tended lawns. Elias Thorne was already awake. At 62 years old, his internal clock was still set to the regimented discipline of his years in the Marine Corps, followed by 3 decades as a letter carrier for the United States Postal Service. He moved through his small kitchen with a quiet efficiency, the linoleum floor creaking familiarly under his work boots. He brewed a pot of black coffee, the dark aroma filling the space that had felt too large and too quiet since his wife Martha passed away 4 years prior. Elias was a man who found his solace in the soil. After finishing his coffee, he walked out to the small plot of land behind his house, a vibrant, chaotic patch of greenery that stood in stark contrast to the concrete and asphalt of the surrounding city. This garden was his sanctuary, a place where he could coax life from the dirt with patience and care. He knelt in the dirt, ignoring the stiffness in his knees, and began to weed the rows of late-season tomatoes and peppers. His hands were rough, mapped with the scars and calluses of a life built on manual labor, but his touch with the plants was surprisingly gentle. To the casual observer, Elias was simply an old man tending to his vegetables. But to the neighborhood, he was a silent anchor. He was the man who kept his porch light on for the nurse who worked the night shift across the street, ensuring she never had to walk to her front door in the dark. He was the one who knew exactly which houses had new babies and would leave bags of produce on their steps without waiting for a thank you. He lived a life of deliberate invisibility, content to be a small, helpful cog in the machinery of his community. He had no way of knowing that miles away, in the gated opulence of Great Falls, a different kind of day was beginning, one driven by ego and noise that would soon tear through his quiet existence with the force of a hurricane. Elias was a man of artifacts and rituals, his life a testament to the belief that character was defined by what you gave away, not what you kept. Inside his garage, meticulously organized shelves held not trophies or expensive toys, but tools, wrenches, saws, and drills that he spent more time using on his neighbors' homes than his own. He was the neighborhood's unofficial mechanic, the man who could coax a sputtering lawnmower back to life or reattach a child's bicycle chain with a few deft movements and a reassuring smile. He never accepted money for these kindnesses. If a neighbor insisted, he would simply tip the brim of his faded baseball cap and ask them to pay it forward. His history was something he carried quietly. A Purple Heart from his service in Vietnam was tucked away in a shoebox in the back of his closet, buried under old tax returns. He never spoke of the war, never marched in parades, and never used his status as a veteran to demand respect. He believed that respect was earned in the present tense, in the daily choice to be decent in an often indecent world. His daughter Sarah often told him he was too soft for the modern world, that his generosity left him open to being taken advantage of. Elias would just chuckle, his eyes crinkling at the corners, and tell her that the world was hard enough without him adding to the weight of it. That Tuesday followed the comfortable groove of his routine. After tending the garden, he spent the afternoon volunteering at the local food bank, loading crates of canned goods with a vigor that belied his age. He joked with the other volunteers, his laugh a low, warm rumble that seemed to vibrate in the chest. He spoke of his plans for the weekend, intending to finally fix the leaking roof of the gazebo in the community park. He spoke of the future as if it were a guaranteed destination, unaware that his timeline had already been severed, that the hours remaining to him could now be counted on one hand. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the Virginia sky in bruised hues of purple and orange, Elias climbed into his 1998 Ford pickup truck. The vehicle was a reflection of its owner, battered, rusting around the wheel wells, but mechanically sound and reliable. The engine turned over with a heavy, sputtering cough, settling into a familiar idle. He pulled out of the parking lot, the bed of the truck rattling empty behind him, and turned onto the winding back roads that would lead him home. He drove slowly, his arm resting on the open window frame, enjoying the cooling air. He was a man at peace, completely unprepared for the violence that was speeding toward him in the luxury of a midnight blue Aston Martin. 30 miles away, in the gated fortress of Great Falls, the morning did not smell of wet earth or blooming flowers. It smelled of filtered air, polished marble, and the sterile silence of extreme wealth. Sterling Vance awoke in a bedroom larger than Elias Thorne's entire house, the silk sheets tangled around his legs. At 19, Sterling was the golden prince of a dynasty built on political influence and ruthless ambition. He was the only son of Senator Cornelius Vance, a man who had taught his heir that the world was divided into two distinct species, the rulers and the resources. Sterling rose from his bed, ignoring the maid who was already quietly collecting his discarded clothing from the floor. He moved through his life with the heavy, unearned confidence of a boy who had never been told no. He stood before the floor-to-ceiling mirror, inspecting his reflection with critical obsession. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with the kind of jawline and teeth that looked purchased rather than inherited. He was the captain of his prep school's lacrosse team, bound for an Ivy League university in the fall, his path paved with donations rather than grades. His day was a masterclass in entitlement. He ate breakfast alone at a mahogany table designed for 12, scrolling through his phone, dismissing texts from girls he had already grown bored of. When his father entered the room, the temperature seemed to drop. The senator did not ask his son how he slept. He asked about his image, reminding him that the Vance name was a brand that required constant maintenance. Sterling nodded, his face a mask of bored compliance, but beneath the surface simmered a volatile mix of pressure and resentment. He was a young man who had been given everything except boundaries, a dangerous combination that had left him devoid of empathy. To Sterling, other people were merely obstacles or audiences, existing only to serve his narrative. By early evening, the walls of the estate felt suffocating. Seeking the rush of adrenaline that was the only thing that made him feel alive, Sterling grabbed the keys to his graduation gift, a midnight blue Aston Martin Vanquish. The engine roared to life with a guttural growl, a sound of raw power that vibrated through the chassis. He tore out of the driveway, the tires screeching against the pavement, leaving the silence of his father's house behind. He drove not to get somewhere, but to feel the dominance of the machine, weaving through traffic with a reckless disregard for the laws of physics and the safety of those around him. The collision of these two disparate worlds, the humble gardener and the entitled prince, occurred at a lonely four-way stop where the manicured suburbs began to bleed into the rural backroads. The sun was dipping below the tree line, casting long, blinding shadows across the asphalt. Elias Thorne's Ford pickup truck, heavy with the day's fatigue, approached the intersection and shuddered. The engine, old and tired, coughed once and died, stalling right in the center of the crossroad. Elias sighed, reaching for the ignition, his movements slow and unhurried. He had stalled 100 times before. It was a quirk of the old truck he had learned to live with. But behind him, the roar of the Aston Martin announced Sterling's arrival like a thunderclap. Sterling was flying, his speedometer climbing past 80 in a 40 zone, when he saw the rusted hulk of the truck blocking his path. He slammed on the brakes, the luxury car fishtailing violently as the anti-lock system fought for traction. The smell of burnt rubber filled the air as the Aston Martin slid, its nose dipping aggressively. It didn't stop in time. With the sickening crunch of metal on metal, the sleek bumper of the sports car clipped the rear fender of the pickup truck. The impact was not catastrophic, merely a jarring scrape that jolted both drivers. In any other circumstance, this would have been a minor insurance inconvenience. Elias stepped out of his truck, his hands raised in an apologetic gesture, ready to ask if the young man was all right. He saw a frightened kid who had been driving too fast, but Sterling Vance did not see an accident. As he stepped out of his low-slung vehicle, inspecting the scratch on his paint, a switch flipped deep within his psyche. The scratch was not just damage to a car, it was an insult to his sovereignty. The adrenaline of the near miss curdled instantly into a white-hot, homicidal rage. He looked at the old man in the faded work clothes and saw not a human being, but a piece of debris that had dared to touch his property. The violence that followed was stark, one-sided, and terrifying in its speed. Sterling didn't reach for his insurance card. He reached into the trunk of his car and pulled out a heavy aluminum baseball bat, a remnant of his athletic career that he kept for protection. He walked toward Elias with a purposeful, predatory stride, the bat dragging slightly against the pavement, creating a metallic rasp that cut through the evening silence. Elias, confused by the weapon and the look of dead-eyed fury on the boy's face, took a step back. "Son," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "it was just an accident. We can fix it." They were the last words he would ever speak. Sterling didn't hesitate. He didn't shout or threaten. He simply swung. The bat connected with Elias's knee, the sickening crack of bone echoing off the trees. Elias crumbled to the asphalt, a cry of shock and pain escaping his lips as he fell into the dirt of the shoulder. It could have ended there. A rational man, even a cruel one, might have seen the old man helpless on the ground and stopped. But Sterling was not operating on rationality. He was operating on a lifetime of unchecked dominance. He stood over the fallen veteran, looking down with a sneer of disgust. He didn't see a man in pain. He saw a bug that needed to be crushed. He swung again and again. The attack was a release of all the pressure, resentment, and entitlement festering inside him. The brutality was intimate and prolonged. Sterling mocked the older man as he struck him, deriding his truck, his clothes, his very existence. "Look at you!" Sterling spat, breathless from the exertion. "You're nothing." When Elias finally stopped moving, lying unconscious and broken in the encroaching darkness, Sterling didn't check for a pulse. He didn't call 911. He simply wiped a speck of blood from his expensive loafers, threw the bat back into his trunk, and got back into his car. He reversed the Aston Martin, the engine purring smoothly, and drove around the dying man, leaving Elias Thorne alone in the silence of the roadside, treating a human life with less regard than roadkill. As the taillights of the Aston Martin disappeared around the bend, swallowed by the twilight, silence rushed back into the clearing. Sterling Vance drove with the windows down, the cool wind whipping through his hair, flushing the adrenaline from his system. He didn't feel guilt. He didn't feel the crushing weight of moral transgression. Instead, he felt a strange, vibrating buzz of invincibility. He reached for his phone, dialing his best friend from the lacrosse team, not to confess a crime, but to complain about the damage to his graduation gift. "Some trash just ran right into me," he shouted over the roar of the engine, his voice dripping with annoyance. "My dad is going to kill me about the paint job." Miles behind him, the reality of his actions lay broken in the dirt. Elias Thorne was still alive, but barely. His breath came in ragged, wet gasps, the sound of his lungs struggling against the trauma inflicted by the aluminum bat. He tried to move, to reach for the cell phone clipped to his belt, but his limbs refused to obey the commands of his fading consciousness. He looked up at the canopy of trees, the leaves turning black against the darkening sky, and thought not of pain, but of the unlatched gate in his garden, and his daughter Sarah, who would be wondering why he was late. Slowly, inevitably, the darkness encroached from the edges of his vision. The wet gasps turned to shallow rattles, and then, finally, to silence. Elias Thorne, a man who had survived the jungles of Vietnam and dedicated his life to community, died alone on the side of a country road. treated like debris by a boy who had never worked a day in his life. He was discovered 40 minutes later by a cyclist pushing hard to beat the sunset. At first, the cyclist thought it was a pile of discarded clothes or a deer hit by a truck. It was only when he slowed down and saw the unnatural angle of the leg and the pool of crimson spreading into the asphalt that the horror took hold. He scrambled for his phone, his hands shaking so violently he dropped it twice before dialing 911. The sirens that soon pierced the evening air were a mournful announcement that the peace of the countryside had been irrevocably shattered. In the cramped but cozy living room of Sarah Thorne's home, the atmosphere was thick with a quiet mounting dread. Sarah had checked her watch 3 times in the last 10 minutes. Her father was a creature of absolute habit. He was never late, and he never let his phone go to voicemail. She stood by the front window, peering out into the street, watching the headlights of passing cars, willing one of them to be the familiar rusted grille of the Ford pickup. She told herself she was being paranoid, that the old truck had probably just broken down again, or that he had stopped to help a neighbor fix a fence. But the subconscious mind often knows tragedy before the conscious mind accepts it. When the police cruiser turned onto her street, slowing to a crawl as it scanned the house numbers, the air left Sarah's lungs. She didn't need to be told. She watched 2 uniformed officers step out of the vehicle, adjusting their hats with a solemn, practiced hesitation. It is a walk every officer dreads. The long march up the driveway to destroy a stranger's life. When the knock came, it sounded like a gavel striking a sounding block. Sarah opened the door before they could knock a second time. She looked at the officers, young men who couldn't meet her eyes, and saw the pity etched into their faces. "Ms. Thorne," one of them asked, his voice soft, professional, and devastating. "May we come inside?" The words were a formality, a polite prelude to the end of her world. As she stepped back to let them in, the cozy living room suddenly felt cold and foreign. They didn't tell her immediately that it was murder. They spoke of an incident, of trauma, but the specific vocabulary of death hung in the air. When the confirmation finally came that her father, the gentlest man she knew, was gone, Sarah didn't scream. She simply collapsed into a chair, a sound escaping her throat that was less a cry and more the sound of a soul breaking in half. The crime scene was a chaotic tableau of flashing blue lights and yellow tape, a scar of modern forensics slashed across the rustic landscape. Detectives Miller and Halloway moved through the scene with clinical detachment, their flashlights cutting through the dark. To the untrained eye, it looked like a hit-and-run gone wrong. But Miller, a 20-year veteran with eyes that had seen too much of the city's darkness, noticed the inconsistencies immediately. The blunt force trauma on the victim's legs and ribs was too focused, too deliberate to be solely from a vehicle impact. This wasn't just a collision, it was an execution. The breakthrough came from the smallest of details. Embedded in the crumpled metal of the Ford's rear bumper was a smear of transfer paint, a deep, metallic midnight blue. It was a specific custom shade that didn't belong on a Honda or a Toyota. Halloway scraped a sample into an evidence bag, labeling it with precise, sterile handwriting. "That's not factory standard," he muttered, looking at the way the paint shimmered, even under the harsh glare of the flashlight. By the time they returned to the precinct, the lab had run a preliminary analysis on the paint chip. The results narrowed the field terrifyingly fast. The paint was Midnight Sapphire, a custom coat exclusive to high-end luxury manufacturers, specifically Aston Martin. In the working-class county of Alexandria, there were only 3 registered vehicles matching that description. 2 belonged to elderly collectors who kept them garaged. The third was registered to a holding company linked to the Vance estate in Great Falls, specifically a graduation gift for a 19-year-old named Sterling. The mood in the bullpen shifted instantly from the grind of procedural work to the high-stakes tension of political dynamite. Miller looked at the name on the screen, then at his partner. They weren't just hunting a killer anymore. They were hunting the son of a United States senator. The machinery of justice, usually so grinding and indifferent, suddenly felt fragile. They knew that making this arrest wouldn't just require handcuffs. It would require ironclad proof, because they were about to declare war on one of the most powerful families in Virginia. Miller picked up the phone to call the district attorney, his hand heavy, knowing that the easy part of the investigation was over. The real fight had just begun. The raid on the Vance estate was a spectacle of colliding realities. At 6:00 a.m., a convoy of unmarked police cruisers rolled through the wrought iron gates of the Great Falls compound, their presence a jarring intrusion into the manicured silence of the wealthy enclave. The senator met them at the mahogany double doors, not with fear, but with the cold, incandescent fury of a man accustomed to wielding the law, not being subject to it. He threatened badges, careers, and funding, his voice echoing off the marble foyer. But the warrant Judge Harrison had signed was watertight, fueled by the undeniable forensic match of the paint chips, while the detectives argued with the father in the foyer. A tactical team moved upstairs to the East Wing. They expected to find a frightened teenager or perhaps a fugitive packing a bag. Instead, they found Sterling Vance lounging in a gaming chair, a headset around his neck, the blue light of a monitor reflecting in his eyes. When the officers burst in, weapons drawn, shouting commands, Sterling didn't flinch. He simply sighed, paused his game, and looked at them with an expression of mild annoyance, as if the maid had interrupted him to ask about laundry. "Do you have any idea what time it is?" he asked, ignoring the Glock pointed at his chest. Outside, in the detached 6-car garage, the final nail in the coffin was being hammered home. Detective Halloway peeled back the car cover of the Aston Martin. There, on the front right bumper, was the fresh, jagged scar of the collision, with microscopic traces of rusted metal from Elias's Ford still embedded in the expensive paint. It was the smoking gun, irrefutable and damning. As Sterling was led out of the mansion in handcuffs, past the horrified gaze of his mother Victoria, he didn't hang his head. He walked with his chin up, looking at the officers with a sneer of amused contempt, treating the walk to the squad car like a red carpet procession he was obligated to attend. The interrogation room at the Fairfax County Police Department was designed to break men. It was a windowless box of cinder block and fluorescent hum, smelling of stale coffee and anxiety. But Sterling Vance sat in the metal chair as if it were a throne. He had been in the room for 2 hours, and in that time he had not uttered a single word to Detective Miller. He sat in a relaxed slouch, picking at a loose thread on his designer jeans, humming a tune under his breath. Beside him sat Arthur Calloway, the Vance family's personal attorney, a man whose suit cost more than Detective Miller made in 6 months. Calloway did the talking, creating a wall of legalese that deflected every question before it could land. Miller tried every tactic in the book: the sympathetic father figure, the bad cop, the confrontation with the crime scene photos. He slid a picture of Elias's battered face across the steel table, watching Sterling's eyes for a flicker of remorse, a flinch, anything human. Sterling barely glanced at the photo. He looked up at Miller, a slow, predatory smile spreading across his face. "Am I done here?" he asked, his voice bored. "My father has a dinner tonight that I'm expected to attend." It was a statement of breathtaking delusion. He was sitting in a homicide unit, accused of beating a war veteran to death, and he was worried about a social engagement. He viewed the detectives not as agents of justice, but as hired help who had stepped out of line. The arrogance was not a mask. It was his fundamental state of being. He knew, with the certainty of gravity, that the rules of this room did not apply to him. The bail hearing was a masterclass in the asymmetry of the American legal system. While Elias Thorne's family was scrambling to pool money for a funeral, Sterling Vance stood before a magistrate who owed his appointment to the senator's political machine. The prosecutor argued passionately for remand, citing the brutality of the crime and the flight risk posed by the family's immense resources. He spoke of the blood on the road and the callousness of the flight, but Calloway countered with smooth, practiced rhetoric about Sterling's ties to the community, his acceptance to Yale, and his clean record. The judge nodded, ignoring the glaring reality of the murder charge, and set bail at $2 million, a sum designed to sound punitive to the public, but which was a rounding error for the Vance Trust. Within an hour, the wire transfer cleared. Sterling didn't spend a single night in a cell. He walked out of the courthouse back into the sunlight, shielding his eyes from the press pack, not out of shame, but because the flashbulbs were annoying. That evening, while Sarah Thorne sat in a funeral home choosing a casket for her father, social media began to circulate a video from a private Instagram account. It showed Sterling at a party in Georgetown holding a red cup, laughing with friends. The caption read, "Can't touch this." The image spread like a virus through the community of Alexandria, igniting a firestorm of outrage. It was a digital middle finger to the victim, a public declaration that Sterling believed he had already won. The contrast between the grieving daughter and the partying killer set the stage for a trial that would become a battleground, not just for a verdict, but for the very soul of the justice system. 3 months later, the trial of the Commonwealth of Virginia versus Sterling Vance began in a courtroom packed to capacity. The air was thick with the humidity of bodies and the static charge of high tension. The defense team, a phalanx of 5 lawyers led by Calloway, entered the room like a corporate merger, carrying leather briefcases and projecting an aura of invincibility. Sterling followed, dressed in a soft gray suit, chosen to make him look younger, softer, more innocent. But the effect was ruined by the look on his face, a faint, persistent smirk that suggested he was watching a play rather than fighting for his life. The prosecution's opening statement was a somber, detailed recitation of the facts. They painted a picture of a gentle man slaughtered for a minor traffic error. But when Calloway stood up, the strategy of the defense became sickeningly clear. He didn't deny the physical altercation, he reframed it entirely. He described Elias Thorne not as a saintly gardener, but as a volatile, erratic figure who had terrified a confused young boy. Sterling Vance was alone on a dark road, Calloway intoned, his voice rich and persuasive. Confronted by a man with a history of military trauma, he acted in panicked self-defense. It was a monstrous lie, a calculated smearing of a dead man who couldn't defend himself. As Calloway assassinated Elias's character, describing the gentle veteran as a threat, Sterling nodded along from the defense table, performing the role of the victim. But every so often he would catch the eye of a reporter or a juror, and the mask would slip, revealing the cold, amused glint of the predator beneath. The emotional crucible of the trial arrived when Sarah Thorne was called to the stand. She walked to the witness box with the heavy, reluctant steps of a woman carrying too much grief. She swore the oath in a trembling voice, clutching a tissue so tightly her knuckles were white. Under the gentle questioning of the prosecutor, she began to humanize the man the defense had tried to turn into a monster. She spoke of his garden, his letters from the war, and the voicemail he had left her just hours before he died, telling her he had harvested enough peppers for her famous salsa. The jury was captivated, many of them openly weeping as the image of the kind, broken man was reconstructed in the air between them. The courtroom was silent, held in the reverence of genuine tragedy. In this heavy silence, a sound cut through the room like a whip crack. It was a loud, exaggerated yawn. Every head turned. At the defense table, Sterling Vance was stretching his arms, covering his mouth with a lazy hand, looking at the ceiling with profound boredom. He wasn't trying to hide it, he was broadcasting it. The disrespect was so visceral that a collective gasp went through the gallery. Judge Harrison, a man known for his judicial temperament, slammed his gavel down with a force that shook the bench. "Mr. Vance," he barked, his face flushing red, "you will show this court and this witness the proper respect, or I will hold you in contempt." Sterling blinked, looking at the judge with feigned confusion, then gave a small, insolent shrug, as if the judge were overreacting to a minor breach of etiquette. Following the emotional testimony, the trial shifted to the cold, hard science of death. Dr. Eris Thorne, the chief medical examiner, no relation to the victim, took the stand to present the autopsy findings. The lights in the courtroom were dimmed, and large, high-definition monitors displayed the gruesome reality of what an aluminum bat does to the human body. The photos were clinical, but horrific. Shattered bone, massive bruising, the fatal trauma to the skull. The jury flinched. Several looked away, unable to process the violence frozen on the screens. Elias's family held each other, burying their faces to avoid seeing the broken shell of the man they loved. But Sterling Vance did not look away. He leaned forward, putting on a pair of wire-rimmed glasses, and studied the images with a detached, almost scientific curiosity. He looked at the destruction he had caused not with horror or guilt, but with the critical eye of an artist inspecting his work. At one point, while the medical examiner described the force required to shatter the patella, Sterling leaned over to Calloway and whispered something, pointing at the screen with a pen. Calloway stiffened and ignored him, but the jury saw it. They saw a young man discussing the mutilated body of his victim as if it were a diagram in a biology textbook. The disconnect between the gruesome evidence and the defendant's casual demeanor began to build a creeping sense of unease in the room. It was becoming clear that they were not dealing with a panicked boy who made a mistake, but with something far colder, something that lacked the basic wiring of human empathy. As the trial entered its second week, the invisible machinery of the Vance dynasty began to hum beneath the floorboards of the courtroom. It was a subtle, pervasive pressure, felt rather than seen. Senator Cornelius Vance sat in the front row every day, his posture rigid, his eyes fixed on the witness stand like gun sights. He rarely spoke, but his presence was a gravitational force that warped the testimony of those who dared to take the oath. The prosecution called Mr. Henderson, a neighbor who had originally given a statement describing Sterling's aggressive driving in the weeks leading up to the murder. In the police report, Henderson had been adamant, describing the Aston Martin terrorizing the quiet streets. But on the stand, under the senator's unblinking gaze, Henderson's memory dissolved into a fog of uncertainty. He stammered, wiped sweat from his upper lip, and suddenly couldn't recall if it was Sterling's car or perhaps another blue vehicle he had seen. The recantation was clumsy and terrified, the hallmark of a man who had received a quiet phone call or a visit in the night. The prosecutor watched his case bleed out in real time, unable to stop the hemorrhaging, while Sterling sat at the defense table, sketching on a legal pad, looking bored by the inevitability of his own exoneration. The lunch recess offered no respite from the macabre theater of the trial. In the courthouse cafeteria, a space smelling of stale coffee and industrial cleaner, the divide between the two families was stark and physical. Elias's family sat huddled in a corner, picking at sandwiches they couldn't eat, speaking in hushed, mournful tones. They looked exhausted, worn down by the grinding pace of a system that seemed designed to protect the powerful. Across the room, separated by an invisible ocean of class and cruelty, sat the defense team. Sterling Vance was the center of gravity at their table. He leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie, laughing loudly at a joke made by one of his junior attorneys. He bit into a pristine apple with a crunch that seemed to echo in the silent room. He didn't glance at the grieving family just 30 feet away. He acted as if he were at a country club luncheon discussing a golf handicap rather than a homicide. The sight of him, healthy, vibrant, and utterly unburdened by conscience, was a second violence inflicted upon the Thorne family, a visual confirmation that to Sterling Vance, their suffering was not even a blip on his radar. When court resumed, Arthur Calloway unveiled the centerpiece of his defense strategy, a legal maneuver so audacious it bordered on satire. He called Dr. Lawrence Sterling, no relation, a forensic psychologist known for his exorbitant fees and creative diagnoses. The doctor testified that Sterling Vance suffered from a condition he termed environmental detachment syndrome, colloquially known as affluenza. The argument was intricate and infuriating. The doctor posited that Sterling's upbringing in a world of unlimited resources and zero consequences had stunted his moral development. He argued that Sterling was literally incapable of understanding the boundaries of others because he had never encountered a boundary he couldn't buy his way through. "He is not a criminal," the doctor intoned, adjusting his spectacles. "He is a victim of his own privilege, a boy who was never given the tools to navigate the real world." In the jury box, a few members exchanged incredulous glances, but Sterling nodded along solemnly from the defense table, adopting the persona of a tragic figure, seemingly convinced that his wealth was a disability that excused murder. Outside the limestone walls of the courthouse, the mood was shifting from observation to insurrection. The audacity of the affluenza defense had leaked to the press, igniting a firestorm of public outrage. A crowd of hundreds had gathered on the steps, holding signs that read, "Justice for Elias and money doesn't buy murder." The chant of "No justice, no peace" penetrated the thick glass of the courtroom windows, a muffled drumbeat of societal anger. During a brief recess, Sterling stood by the window of the holding room, looking down at the sea of protesters below. His lawyer advised him to step away, to avoid inciting the crowd, but Sterling ignored him. He pressed his hand against the glass, looking at the angry faces with a sneer of disgust. "Look at them," he muttered, loud enough for the bailiff to hear. "Animals. They're just jealous because they'll never matter." He viewed the public outcry not as a moral judgment, but as the envy of the peasantry. further cementing his delusion that he was a different species entirely, governed by a higher set of rules. By late Thursday afternoon, the prosecution rested its case. It should have been a triumphant moment, the culmination of forensic science and witness testimony. But the atmosphere in the room was heavy with doubt. The senator's intimidation tactics had watered down the witness list, and the affluenza defense had introduced a cloud of psychological confusion. The prosecutor sat down with a heavy sigh, knowing he had thrown everything he had at the defendant, but fearing it wasn't enough to pierce the armor of the Vance estate. Sterling Vance sensed the shift in momentum. He straightened his tie, sitting up taller in his chair. He looked at the jury, not with the fake humility he had worn earlier, but with a returning spark of his natural arrogance. He exchanged a fist bump with Calloway under the table. To Sterling, the game was almost over. He had weathered the storm, his father had pulled the strings, and the finish line was in sight. He was already planning his victory party, completely unaware that the ground beneath his feet was about to open up and swallow him whole. The defense was about to call their final character witness, a woman Sterling regarded as nothing more than a silent prop in his life's movie, unaware she was holding the match that would burn it all down. The defense began its closing gambit with the air of a symphony conductor approaching the final crescendo. Arthur Calloway stood buttoning his jacket with a flourish and announced his final witness, Victoria Vance. A ripple of whispers moved through the gallery. The senator's wife had been a silent ghost throughout the proceedings, a stoic figure in Chanel suits who revealed nothing. The media had painted her as the grieving mother, the steadfast matriarch standing by her persecuted son. For Sterling, this was the victory lap. He leaned back, shooting a glance at the jury that bordered on conspiratorial. He knew exactly what his mother would say, because it had been rehearsed at the dinner table for years. She would speak of his charity work, his gentleness with the family dogs, and the pressure placed on him by his father. She would weep on cue, a few tasteful tears that would humanize him and wash away the brutality of the crime scene photos. He watched the double doors, a small confident smile playing on his lips, waiting for his greatest defender to take the stage and finish the script. Victoria Vance stood up from the front row. She was a woman of immaculate presentation, her hair pulled back in a severe, elegant chignon, her pearls resting against a black dress that cost more than the prosecutor's car. But as she moved toward the witness stand, something was off. Her gait was not the fluid glide of a socialite. It was stiff, heavy, as if she were walking underwater against a strong current. The courtroom fell into a silence so profound that the hum of the air conditioning sounded like a roar. The rhythmic click-clack of her heels on the parquet floor echoed off the high ceilings. As she passed the defense table, Sterling turned to catch her eye, ready to offer a reassuring nod. But Victoria did not look at him. She stared straight ahead, her gaze fixed on a point on the far wall, her jaw set in a line of granite tension. She passed the senator without acknowledging him, ignoring the subtle commanding clear of his throat. She climbed the steps to the witness box, placed her hand on the Bible, and swore the oath in a voice that was brittle and hollow, like dried leaves crushing underfoot. Calloway approached the stand with a gentle, deferential smile, treating Victoria like a fragile vase he was terrified of breaking. He began with the easy questions, the softballs designed to paint a portrait of domestic idyll. He asked about Sterling's childhood, his grades, his future. Victoria answered in monosyllables, her hands clutching her purse so tightly that her knuckles were white. Sensing the jury needed more emotion, Calloway pivoted to the heart of the defense strategy. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his voice dropping to a warm conspiratorial register, "we have heard a lot of theories in this room. We have heard about affluenza and environmental detachment. But you are his mother. You know his heart better than anyone." He paused for dramatic effect, leaning against the railing. "Tell this court, is your son Sterling a gentle soul? Is he capable of the malice the prosecution has described?" The question hung in the air. This was the moment. The script called for a tearful denial, a passionate defense of her boy. Sterling smirked, waiting for the exoneration, but the silence stretched. 5 seconds. 10. It became uncomfortable, then heavy, then suffocating. Victoria looked down at her hands, then slowly raised her eyes to meet Sterling's smirk. "No," she whispered. Calloway froze. He chuckled nervously, assuming he had misheard. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Vance. Could you repeat that?" Victoria straightened her spine, her voice gaining a sudden, terrifying clarity. "No, he is not a gentle soul, and he is not a victim of his environment. He is exactly who the prosecution says he is." The courtroom erupted. Calloway stammered, raising his hand to stop her, but Victoria was already moving. She reached into her designer purse, not for a tissue as everyone expected, but for a small black burner phone. "He thought I would hide this," she said, her voice trembling with a mix of rage and sorrow. "He gave it to me the night of the murder. He told me to destroy it because it had the trophy on it. He laughed when he showed me. He laughed about the noise the old man made." Sterling's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by a look of pale, uncomprehending shock. The senator stood up in the front row, shouting for an objection, but the judge slammed his gavel, ordering silence. Victoria held the phone out to the bailiff, her hand shaking. "I am done protecting a monster," she declared, looking directly at her son. "I will not let that man's death be another thing we buy our way out of." Over the strenuous, panicked objections of the defense team, Judge Harrison admitted the phone into evidence immediately. The courtroom monitors flickered to life. The video was shaky, filmed vertically on a cell phone. It showed the dark roadside, illuminated by the headlights of the Aston Martin. The audio was crisp and devastating. It captured the sickening thud of the bat hitting bone, the pained groans of Elias Thorne, and above it all, the clear, jubilant laughter of Sterling Vance. "Look at him crawl!" Sterling's voice on the recording was gleeful, breathless with exertion. "Do you know who I am? You're trash." As the video played, the real Sterling Vance in the courtroom underwent a horrific transformation. The cool, detached prince dissolved. His face turned a mottled red, veins bulging in his neck. He didn't cover his ears. He stared at his mother with eyes wide with betrayal. Then he snapped. "You traitor!" he screamed, his voice cracking into a guttural roar. He lunged out of his chair, scrambling over the defense table, clawing toward the witness stand. "I own you. You stupid bitch. I own you." Pandemonium broke loose. 3 bailiffs tackled Sterling to the floor before he could reach his mother. He thrashed and spat, screaming obscenities, revealing to the jury and the world the raw, unfiltered rage that lay beneath the Italian suit. The mask had not just slipped, it had been torn off, confirming every word Victoria Vance had just spoken. The chaos in the courtroom was brief but violent. It took 3 deputies to subdue Sterling Vance, pinning him to the carpet in front of the jury box, his face pressed against the floorboards, his bespoke suit twisting and tearing in the struggle. Even as the handcuffs clicked shut, the sound sharp and final in the stunned silence, Sterling continued to spit venom at his mother, his voice a raw, animalistic snarl that echoed off the high ceilings. He was dragged back to his chair, not as the poised heir to a dynasty, but as a shackled, panting animal. The jury stared at him in horrified fascination. The affluenza defense, carefully constructed over weeks of testimony, had evaporated in 30 seconds of unbridled rage. They were no longer looking at a confused boy who didn't understand consequences. They were looking at a predator who had just shown them exactly how Elias Thorne had died. Senator Cornelius Vance sat frozen in the front row, his face ashen, looking at his son with the dawning realization that the monster on the floor was a creature of his own making. Victoria Vance did not flinch. She remained on the stand, watching the deputies hoist her son upright, her eyes dry and terrifyingly empty, like a surgeon who had just amputated a gangrenous limb to save the body. Closing arguments were a formality, a grim funeral procession for a defense that was already dead. Arthur Calloway, usually a titan of rhetoric, stood before the jury with his shoulders slumped, his confidence shattered. He mumbled through a brief, obligatory speech about reasonable doubt, but he couldn't even meet the eyes of the jurors. He knew there was no speech in the history of jurisprudence that could unring the bell of Sterling's outburst. The prosecutor, by contrast, needed no theatrics. He simply walked to the podium and pointed a finger at Sterling, who now sat shackled to the table, his face mottled with red splotches of fury. "They told you he was a gentle soul," the prosecutor said, his voice low and steady. "They told you he was a victim. But today, the mask fell. You saw the man who killed Elias Thorne. You heard his laughter on that tape, and you saw his rage on this floor. Believe your eyes." He sat down after less than 2 minutes. The silence that followed was heavier than any closing speech could have been. Jury deliberations in a capital murder trial can often stretch for days, fueled by debate and moral agonizing. But in the case of the Commonwealth versus Sterling Vance, the deliberation was merely a procedural pause. The jurors filed into the room, took a single vote, and knocked on the door 45 minutes later. The speed of their return was a message in itself. When the bailiff announced that a verdict had been reached, the air in the courtroom seemed to crystallize. Sterling Vance sat rigidly, the earlier adrenaline fading into a cold, creeping dread. For the first time in his 19 years, the silence of a room was not deferential. It was predatory. He looked to his father for a signal, a nod, some indication that the fix was in, but the senator was staring at the floor, unable to bear the weight of the moment. The clerk stood, her hands trembling slightly as she unfolded the paper that would define the rest of a young man's life. "We, the jury," the foreman announced, his voice clear and unwavering, "find the defendant, Sterling Vance, guilty of murder in the first degree." The word guilty hung in the air, vibrating with the force of a physical blow. A sob broke from the back of the room, not from Sterling's family, but from Elias Thorne's daughter, a sound of release after months of holding her breath. Sterling flinched as if he had been struck. He blinked rapidly, his mouth opening and closing in a silent fish-like motion. He looked at his lawyers, waiting for them to object, to argue, to stop the proceedings. But they were packing their briefcases. The senator put his head in his hands, a titan of industry reduced to a grieving father in a cheap suit. Victoria Vance did not move. She watched the verdict land with the stoicism of a woman who had already mourned her son years ago, the day she realized what he was. The invincible aura of the Vance dynasty had evaporated, stripped away by the single word of a jury foreman, leaving Sterling exposed and naked before the law. Judge Harrison did not delay sentencing. He looked over his spectacles at the young man shackled before him, his expression one of profound disappointment. "Mr. Vance," the judge said, his voice rumbling like distant thunder, "you have lived a life of extraordinary privilege. You were given every advantage, and yet you possess a poverty of spirit that is truly tragic. You treated a human life as an inconvenience, and this court as a game. I sentence you to life in prison without the possibility of parole." The finality of the sentence hit Sterling with the force of a physical impact. The smirk, the arrogance, the boredom, it all dissolved into pure, distilled terror. The reality of forever crashed down on him. He wouldn't be going back to the estate. He wouldn't be going to Yale. He would be dying in a concrete box. As the bailiffs moved to escort him out, Sterling Vance broke. The facade of the Golden Prince shattered, revealing the frightened child beneath. "Dad," he screamed, turning toward the gallery. Tears finally streaming down his face, not for Elias, but for himself. "Dad, fix it! Don't let them take me! Dad!" His screams echoed off the mahogany walls, desperate and pathetic, unanswered by the man who had spent a lifetime fixing everything else. The senator did not look up. Victoria Vance turned her back and walked out of the courtroom doors into the bright afternoon sun. The heavy oak doors of the court slammed shut, sealing Sterling Vance inside the darkness he had created, leaving him with nothing but the echo of his own name and a lifetime of silence to think about it.